All right, welcome to Gold Enterprises Gateway course called At a Loss for Words, Finding Language to Discuss Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Really glad that you're here. If you're here with me right now, this is probably one of your first times having a relatively formal course that talks about these particular words, the language, the definitions, and how they are applied. So really glad that you're here with us, and let's get started. So the goal of our time together today is three different things. First, we want to provide language to describe the lived experiences of folks that you work with every single day in your organizations. They may be your internal staff, your external stakeholders, it may be those that you provide services to, but there is language that attempts to define lived experiences. So we'll get into that. We definitely want to touch upon some of those hot topics. So they might not be definitions to describe individuals' identities, but they're concepts that you'll need to know as someone who's a leader, not an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but someone who's aware and knows the right questions to ask and then how to apply that new information given that hot topic. So hopefully you're listening to this very soon after I've recorded it for you, but just know that these hot topics, some of them stay the same and have been the same across my 25 plus year career, and others of these are relatively new. And so with that, we'll continue to update this coursework. And then third, we want to provide a plan for staying with it, because we realize as people that do this work every single day, it can be tough to keep up with the language as it emerges. That's literally why it's called emerging identities, because the folks that are part of those particular identity groups, they get to determine how they describe themselves, which evolves and changes over time. And so we want to provide you with a plan to stay up with that, given that this is not your professional area possibly. And so you'll need a plan for staying up to speed on things that aren't your primary area or purview in your role, but still are directly applicable to your work and those that you may serve. Well, let me introduce myself once again. I'm Dr. Shauna Payne Gold. I go by she, her, hers pronouns, and Gold is actually my last name. So thank you for being with me. I have 28 years of teaching, facilitation, and professional development experience in nonprofit organizations, including colleges and universities. And so I'm really happy to not exactly tell you what to do, but oftentimes give you some context and some new information to apply to your unique context. I have been a Truth and Racial Healing Circle facilitator. I have been a Train the Trainer for intergroup and interrelations dialogue, which it's its own art and science. I remember when I was facilitating Train the Trainer sessions in dialogue at Towson University right outside of Baltimore. And I remember one of our participants saying that this isn't just training as far as professional training, this is human training when it comes to working and simply being with other humans. Dialogue is really crucial to that, especially in contexts where we're not trained or even mentored, professionally developed. If you think dialogue, it's usually discussion and debate. So we'll get into that later. I'm also a ProSci certified change management practitioner. So I went through those 40 hours of training and applied an actual project that needed change. And frankly, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, all of it is change that we need to manage. I didn't even know change management was a field until recently. And then I went through the certification program along with all of my team that really made us stand out from other individuals who do really great DEI work, but they needed that change management bridge between diversity, equity, inclusion, and strategic planning and action planning. So we built that bridge for ourselves and our clients. I am also Coach Diversity certified through Howard University. The wonderful Coach Diversity program is just really phenomenal for people at all different levels of coaching. And when I left my higher ed background, I got on a waiting list for the Bank of America Women's Entrepreneurship Program at Cornell, thinking in 2020 that, okay, well, maybe I'll be able to get into this program. And then a global pandemic happened and I forgot that I even applied to the waiting list. The very Monday after I resigned from my full-time position in higher education to go into this work full-time, I was brought on. I actually received a congratulations welcome into this program, which was serendipitous for me. And for those of us who are faith and value-laden folks, I felt like it was just really aligning with my purpose. And so I was really grateful to be a part of that program for several months. And then after that, building upon that experience, was selected as the one representative of Maryland to be a Tory Burch Fellow in 2023. Later, a 6-month program in the U.S. SBA Thrive program between 2024 and 2025, which now is defunct. So the last DC cohort. And now I'm embarking upon this wonderful journey with the Trinity New York City Fellowship that starts in fall of 2025 that focuses on social impact strategy, which is really kind of retirement, if you will. So I bring all of this, including my doctorate in education, as part of this journey, because frankly, when I first started 28 years ago, there wasn't a formal degree program. There wasn't even a certificate or a master's degree in this type of work. You had sociology, history, and so forth, but nothing like what we have now, like, for example, George Mason's really wonderful program for chief diversity officers, for example. So I had to build my own experience, and here I am with you. So when it comes to this content, let me just be clear that this content is not for people who aren't interested in professional development. This is part of a growing toolkit of yours. This is not for folks where growing as a human being is not of interest to them. Folks that are okay being where they are, unfortunately, relatively stagnant, which not only affects them individually, but affects those that are around them, especially if you're in a leadership role to directly influence others. If you're not interested in going from good to great, this is not for you, because I guarantee that you're really good at your role and responsibilities, especially if you've had a few years in the game, if you will. But this can be the tipping point for you. And so with that, I strongly encourage you to soak up all you can from this work. Also, this requires discomfort. And I really don't want people to run from discomfort any longer, because it's one thing to be made uncomfortable, which I've seen some facilitators do to participants without a real goal or objective to that discomfort. But I call it productive discomfort. There are going to be some topics that we discuss that may be uncomfortable for you, but they're also the opportunity to have a growing edge for you. So I'm encouraging you to take advantage of those discomfort moments as we get into this conversation on language. We want you to be able to improve your work. So if you're not interested in that, you're in the wrong place here. We want you to be interested in taking your work to the next level. Good enough is not for folks here. And then also we want you to be interested in improving your overall organization as one piece of that larger ecosystem. So you have to be interested in improving your organization to even be here. So hopefully we have the right crowd in front of us. All right. All right, so let's dive into the language. This is really the bread and butter of this work here. The language that you may not have heard at all, or you may have heard of before, but you might not have had some common baseline definitions of the work. One of the words that always gets people hung up is equality versus equity. We're going to get into that, but I guarantee you there are going to be some words that you either do not know or you thought you knew, and we're going to give you some baseline definition for moving forward. All right, so of course, the first word, diversity, should be defined because, again, oftentimes we think of one thing. We might think of only race or only gender. But when we're talking about diversity, we are talking about varied human differences and characteristics. Diversity is an essential characteristic of strong organizations, and we know that supportive and nurturing organizations invite and respect these differences. Now, last summer, I was able to go to Japan on a study tour with my middle schooler and the rest of my family, the 4 of us, And what was really interesting to me is when we went to a major science center, everything that I read and experienced made diversity fundamental. It was just part and parcel with biology. It was part and parcel with the experience of science. It was never a homogenous experience where everything was the same. And so I wish we could bring that into society and social science that we do, but it's not as commonplace. Oftentimes it's used as a buzzword, especially now, most recently, when we have a lot of anti-DEI work that is rolling across the country on local, state, federal levels. And so just getting down to the bare bones of the science of diversity, it is human difference. Now, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when I first got a smartphone, and to the left there, you'll see those icons that were used previously. And a lot of them were kind of that really ugly mustard color. I don't even know where that mustard color came from because I don't think that there's anyone in the world that's actually that mustard color. I may be wrong on that, but what I know is that there was a limit to the diversity that was shared. And so I remember that on our social media icons even, and it was just limiting because there are people that did not see themselves in these particular icons. And then later, as we got more sophisticated, we saw that there were actually more human differences. And so we saw something that looked more like this, where you got to select the skin color or the shape and size of the glasses like the ones I have on. Maybe you want a bow tie or a long tie, or maybe a hijab, or maybe you're like my sons that created their avatar. They created mine where they put a mole on the end of my nose on the avatar because I actually have one, right? And so we get more and more sophisticated over time. I remember a wonderful friend of mine who is blonde haired and blue eyed, long blonde hair, flowing, can be pulled back in a long ponytail. But as a male, he could not find himself in icons back in the day, and now he can. And so, given that, they're very human differences that are just biologically sound. Okay. Then we get into equality and equity. Okay. I was just in a training not even 2 weeks ago, and there was a wonderful woman in the group that I'm so grateful she was candid with her question. But I was going into the definition of equity, and she said, wait, but I thought that we wanted equality. I thought that was the goal. I thought the goal was everyone being equal. And that may have been true during certain civil rights movements and other movements of the day, but I want us to get even more sophisticated with that. This cartoon is a really cool one because that person over there that's handing out the feed to the different animals, they're obviously handing out the same amount of feed to each and every animal. And as you can see, I don't even know what that small animal is, but as you can see, I would imagine that the small animal would not need as much feed as the larger horse, I believe it is there, or the kangaroo, or the dog. And so as you can see, they say it's fair. Everyone gets the same amount. Yeah, that may be fair, but is it equitable? Because I think that horse is going to starve, okay? And so given that, we want to think about not only what's equal, but what is fair based on individual need. And with that, let's move into some visuals because there's so many. I just picked a few of my favorites that I felt really spoke to the message here. Let's start with equity. So with equity, let's think about the differences between the two. In that first image on the left, it's assumed that everyone will benefit from the same support. So as you can see, the context is that they're trying to watch a baseball game. They are behind a fence and they are of different heights. And so equality would be that each person of different height was provided the same size box in order to get them closer to seeing over the fence. Well, that doesn't seem to work, right? That doesn't seem to work. So in that second image, you have the same three individuals and they're given different supports that make it possible to see the baseball game. And as you can see, the taller person doesn't receive a support at all because frankly, they don't need it because they're a bit taller to see over the fence. And the small person receives two supports in order to see over the baseball fence. So they are now being treated not equally, but equitably based on the need so that they have a chance at the same outcome. And the same outcome is a chance to be able to see the baseball game. And then that third image is the fence is changed entirely so that they can see through it. So now we've broken down that system that keeps people out when it comes to access. And so now, frankly, less supports are needed overall because the system has been created in such a way that everyone has access. All right. So equality would be providing the same boxes, provide the same thing to everybody. Equity is the creation of opportunities for those that have been historically underrepresented so that they can have equal access to opportunities, networks, and information. So equality is providing what folks need so that they have a equal access to the outcome. So the process may be equitable, but the outcome hopefully is equal, right? So I appreciate these particular visuals, and I'll give you one more that will help us to think this through. I'm an avid cyclist. Let me just say that. I love riding bikes, whether it's indoor cycling or outdoor cycling, doesn't matter. I love it. I love the wind in my face, if you will. And so with that, here's another simple way to think about equality versus equity. Equality, as you can see, would be providing the same bike to different folks with different needs. So as you can see, the person in the wheelchair cannot use that upper bike at all. The tall person looks extremely uncomfortable on that bike because their back is bent over and they're in really bad posture there. And then the small person, it looks like their feet can't even reach the pedal. So I'm not even sure how the bike can be used at all. Okay. But then we get into equity. Now, this is where we see some differences. If you're like me and you've ever been professionally fitted for a bike before, you know that even a centimeter of ill fit means that you're going to have an uncomfortable bike ride. So let's get into the comfortable bike rides. You will see that the person that was in the wheelchair now has access to a pleasant and comfortable bike ride through that hand cycle, right? The tall person now doesn't have to ride bent over. And in fact, it looks like they have a little bit of a smile or a smirk on their face. They look much more comfortable because that back is not bent over. A taller, bigger bike. And then the small person can now reach the pedals and can have a comfortable bike ride. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, those that don't want to understand or embrace equality and equity would say in a regular setting, well, we shouldn't just give people everything that they want and they have to work for it and they have to work for access. That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true that folks will still have to work. As you can see, in that equity category, everyone still has to pedal. Based on what I can see, none of these are motorized bikes here, so nobody's doing the pedaling for them. They still have to put the effort in to pedal the bike to have the chance of a pleasant bike ride, right? But with equality, given the same thing, it's not even possible to have a pleasant bike ride. Some of these bikes can't even be mounted. And that's exactly what happens in real time in real spaces. We all will still need to put forth effort, even in equitable spaces, but at least there now is a chance when there wasn't with equality. Okay. And you'll see a lot of visuals out there. So I encourage you to embrace the visual that works best for you when you're learning. So now let's get into inclusion. Inclusion means to involve, empower, and provide a sense of belonging to people of all backgrounds. Inclusion is the process of getting diversity to function equitably. In other words, you can't assume that equity is present just because diversity is there. I have worked with organizations where diversity was absolutely there, but there was very little equity involved, right? And it reminds me of some of the stories that my mother shares with me. She went to school during integration right after Brown versus Board of Education in Virginia, Southern Virginia, in fact. And of course, we know oftentimes that there are laws that are passed or Supreme Court decisions that are made, and then it still takes time for society to catch up with those decisions. And so my mother, between her junior and senior year, from kindergarten all the way up to her junior year, she was in all African American schools, all Black schools, because of segregation. But then, as a senior in high school, she was integrated into what would become eventually my high school. And so at that time, yes, there was diversity there because she was able to attend classes and so forth, as she should be. But unfortunately, some of those extracurricular activities that she was involved in previously at her segregated school, they were not welcoming to her. So being a part of the band as a majorette was not welcoming to her. She was not allowed to try out for those or other extracurricular events that they were not allowed or encouraged to participate in. But fast forward 30 years later, when I attended, I had both diversity and I had much more inclusion involved because I was welcomed into those extracurricular activities and some of the things that my mom historically was not able to. So the dot visual really helps us to think about this exclusion, for example, just being completely outside of a system that would be that piece of that would lead into segregation that my mom experienced. Separation, where yes, there are, for example, two different schools, one for one group and one for another group of folks. So there's access, but very limited and in separated ways. Integration, where you bring everyone together and there's still some siloing involved. And then inclusion, meaning that it's equally distributed across the power dynamics of a group, organization, school, right? So this gives us a bit to think about when it comes to inclusion. If you're an organization that has lots of diversity, I would encourage you to pay attention to where inclusion and exclusion may exist. All right, so then we get into cultural competence. Cultural competence. This is a skill set that I want you to think about intentionally. Cultural competence requires that you apply knowledge and skills in four general areas. Of course, being aware of your own worldview, which requires some reflection. That requires us to even go back to our upbringing and all of our experiences. I would suggest us to think about different phases and stages in our lives. So whether it was, for example, childhood, pre-K, through high school, if you went away to the military or to college or some other sort of experience and beyond, each stage and phase in your life and what you were mentored or raised to think and believe, and the limitations of that, right? And your limits to exposure and so forth. I remember listening to an interview of two NFL players that were brothers. They are biracial, Black and German, and I remember them talking about how they were fluent in both English and German because of their mother. And so their worldview was quite different, especially because they ended up attending a French charter school. So imagine being born and then raised to be trilingual, right? Their worldview is quite different than a little girl like me who's African American from Southern Virginia, grew up in a very conservative environment and only to this day speaks English fluently. My worldview is obviously going to be quite limited compared to theirs, for example. The recognition of one's attitudes towards cultural difference. So what's our posturing towards cultural difference? Do we immediately think any cultural difference is less than, negative, or worse than our own? Or are we open to all of it, right? Posturing there. Realization of different cultural practices and worldviews. And so instead of passing judgment on an experience or a behavior, thinking about how it's crucial for us to consider how others may just go through life differently, right? And then thoughtfulness on a cross-cultural interaction. Are we even of the mindset that something is going on here that is different from our own experience, right? Let me give you an example of this. I worked for almost 10 years at the University of Maryland, and I loved it working there in the Office of Multi-Ethnic Student Education. And we oftentimes had an end of year event that celebrated the multi-ethnic seniors that were graduating from the university. And I remember standing in a receiving line where each and every student, usually hundreds of students, would walk across the stage and shake our hands, each and every one of us on the stage at the time. And at that time, I was the only woman that was on the stage as an administrator. And I remember a student, a male student, simply walking through the line. He smiled at me, but he kept walking and did not shake my hand. That was my first year of that reception. And my first initial thought was, hmm, maybe it's because I'm a woman that he didn't shake my hand. That seems a little disrespectful. And I started in my mind playing through this entire judgment of that student. Well, I was not thinking from a culturally competent perspective, despite working in the Office of Multi-Ethnic Student Education. That student was a very devout and observant Muslim student who saw it as a sign of respect to not shake my hand. And I so appreciated thinking through that after a while and learning more and processing this with my other female colleagues that knew the student better and could give me a different worldview. And so it was a great lesson for me as a professional not to jump to conclusions when someone acts in a way that would be different from my own thought or proclivity, right? So just being of the mindset to think that maybe there is a behavior that's different intentionally for a reason that is not malicious, not punitive, not ugly, but in fact the opposite, rewarding, respectful, and honorable, right? Being of the mind to think that way. All right, so back in 2005, Williamsberger and McClendon coined the phrase inclusive excellence in higher education specifically, and then lots of other industries caught on to applying this language to their work. And inclusive excellence really boils down to that bottom right area of excellence, meaning that Williams and his colleagues felt that colleges and universities are inherently more excellent when they include diverse people, more ideas, more experiences, and more solutions to current challenges. And why would that not apply to an industry agnostic perspective? That has applied to every organization I've worked with, that we are inherently more excellent because we have more diversity, more equity, more inclusive ideas that help us to be better and think from different perspectives. It kind of reminds me in the National Football League here in the United States, where you have the eye in the sky, right? That camera that can see from all different perspectives. Well, if we have diversity of perspective, which means diversity of experience, which means diversity of biological identity, all of that ties into more excellent organizations as far as how they function, their outcomes, and how they serve others. So I have to be honest with you, reflecting back to my younger days professionally, I started in that top left corner, the social justice perspective of this work. I don't care if we have solid outcomes. I don't care if we have KPIs. I don't care if we have the measurement of this work. It is the right thing to do. In fact, this aligns with my values, my faith perspective, but this is the upper echelon of being simply good people to one another. And I still hold fast to that. But I learned very quickly that that's not the only way to perceive all of this, right? And in fact, there may be some people that get engaged in this work that never perceive diversity, equity, and inclusion in this way. So it's imperative for us to come from various angles. We may not ever be able to invite folks or convince folks to believe that this is a altruistic perspective worth pursuing, right? So in the face of that, we have to think about this from different ways. Yes, there is, in fact, documented economic benefits to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so with that, we have to think about these more efficient organizations as a result of diversity, equity, and inclusion across our stakeholders, more creative teams because they're coming from different perspectives like that eye in the sky I talked about before. And also being able to maximize the human resources rather than just ticking off a checkbox of which identities are present, right? Also, too, I pay attention to those industries that are being left behind because they are not interested in this work. And so, what markets are they missing out on? Now, let me give you an example of this bottom left area of market: engaging diverse audiences, demographic shifts, and expanded consumer bases. I remember for my 40th birthday, I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but for my 40th birthday, I actually hosted a group of my girlfriends to go out to dinner and then go to see the newly released Black Panther movie, right? Part of the Marvel universe. And what I thought was so fascinating as I continued to read the reports of course, ticket sales, but also their budgets that they used to produce the movie. What they found was that there was an entire market that was thirsty for these characters. Folks that, yes, they may have already known and been really well versed in the Marvel universe of heroes and movies, and even um, some of those cartoons that we used to watch, or even the comic books that my grandfather used to have with Black Panther. But they also widened their market because you had African Americans that knew nothing about the Marvel universe, did not care about other heroes, but heard and saw themselves in the videography, even the costuming by Ruth Carter, a graduate of HBCU, Hampton University. They saw themselves, and so they doubled and tripled the market that they previously had in the superhero genre. And so, with that, we would almost be a fool not to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in this way, because it opens up markets that we have not considered in the past. Okay. So, you have to consider, what's your why? It's my hope that a lot of people hang out in the blue area like I did originally, that it's the right thing to do. And I still hang out there. But we also need to get more sophisticated. Think about the economic impacts of not embracing this work, the market value of not embracing this work, and the lack of excellence that we never will aspire to or even accomplish if we don't reach and strive for inclusive excellence, right? Now, I will say it's also very important for us to think about this concept that Lily Zhang brings up in their book, DEI Deconstructed, that there's been a lot of DEI business cases that have floated about for years. I've seen many of them in my 25 plus year experience with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And let me tell you, I'm more impressed and leaning towards this new business case that Lily brings up, because this really helps us to think about this work in multifaceted ways. Okay. And so, with that, let's think about it from the bottom up. Know the numbers. I think that's been the Achilles heel for those of us that are in diversity, equity, and inclusion as strategists, is that oftentimes we think about the soft language and the soft skills, which are extremely important, but we also don't speak the language of facts, stats, both the qualitative and quantitative data to describe and to inform what we do. So we need to know the numbers. Now, with that, that means that we need to build upon those numbers alternative metrics as well. So, thinking about community trust, how much folks trust us both internally and externally to our organizations, being able to sustain diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have to say, I'm a witness to the lack of sustainability around these topics. As one that served as a interim director of a multicultural center for years at a time, because it was not sustainable for the organization to think about where to permanently place the role. We have to think about sustainability, or it's not going to be taken seriously. And then, of course, that leads to the longevity of the work. How many decades of work do we have in this area? And how important will it be to our work moving forward? Okay. Also, profit can't solely persuade, right? It is one piece of the puzzle, especially if you're talking about corporate ventures. But also, we have to think about both the profit and the saving, right? Think about the thousands of dollars that it costs when we have turnover of good people, because folks who may look like me or folks that are underrepresented historically in your industry don't feel comfortable there. And so they leave. And then that costs you to replace, to recruit, hire, retain, on board, all that costs you. And so it's not just a profit, but it's also the loss. What's the loss of not doing this work? Then what are the outcomes? We can't solely think about intentions because usually we could have intentions that can fail if we don't measure and we don't look at what was the outcome. It's kind of the sausage, right? We put all these things in, but what do we get out exactly? Okay. And then a community definition of success, right? So a corporate board's definition of success may have nothing to do with and be completely detached and oblivious to the needs of those that they may serve or engage with. So the further you are at the top of that org chart, the further detached you may be from others' definition of success. And so having an inclusive and participatory strategic planning model and just ongoing engagement will be crucial to your work. My organization, Gold Enterprises, does a lot of inclusive and participatory strategic planning work, and that's where we're seeing a new approach to the business of diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, so let's get into identity. All right. Identity is something that all of us have, right? And when we think of it, we have to think about it in multiple layers, okay? So we have our personal identities. So things that are unique to us, unique characteristics that make up who we are, that are solely personal and make us unique and down to our DNA. We are individualized based on our unique mix of experiences, interests, and history, if you will. And then we have a social identity, meaning a person's sense of who they are based on their relativity to particular groups, group membership, if you will. So yes, I'm Shauna, but I'm also a member of this group that is Black and African American and women, right? And a mother and a granddaughter, a daughter, etc. So given that, I have some social identities that I adhere to. Now, given that, I also realize that the list of things that I just brought up there, being Black, African American, mother, etc., they're often impacted by the shared history of who we are, whether it's law, policy, or just cultural norms in general, right? So Johns Hopkins University uses this model of a social identity wheel and has been used for many, many years. And as you can see, it breaks down a lot of different identity groups that I think are important and a good starting point to talking about personal identity and social identity. And this is not the only one. There are many of them. I'm going to share just a few with you as we move forward, but just know that you as an individual can reflect on each and every one of these areas and describe yourself in each and every one of these areas. And think about this, think about the complexity of this. Not only can you use this to reflect on your particular areas, but also everyone around you in your organization, external to your organization, stakeholders, collaborators, each and every individual and group also has their own unique social identity wheel. We will not know every single element of their social identity wheel, but we need to keep our minds open to the notion that there are identities that are all mixed in that will need to be considered as they emerge based on their relevance to your work. Okay. So remember, you can really think through all of these for yourself and reflect on it in such a way that you start to think about identities that you probably have not thought about frequently or recently. But I would suggest that those areas that you think about least are also our areas of privilege. We'll get into what privilege is in just a minute. But think about how you would describe yourself in each one of these areas. Shauna, my age is at the time 47. My physical ability, I'm a fully able-bodied person. We can talk about gender, race, ethnicity. I could fill in the blank for each and every one of these, but just know you can do that too. And remember that people around you are also holding all of their identities in these particular categories. All right, here are a few more. Selfishly, I'll share with you my social identity wheel here that was created in collaboration with Dr. Lisa Ingerfield, who is my co-host on our podcast, Unfazed, Unedited, where we talk about these topics all the time. And we thought to ourselves, well, The previous social identity wheel from Johns Hopkins is really good, and it's a starting point that I use with folks that are new to the conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. This one is a bit more sophisticated, and if you take the time to really look at it, you'll find quite a few differences compared to the one that we saw from Hopkins. The first major difference is, as you can see, there are no clear delineated lines between the identity groups. They are, in fact, fuzzy for a reason, intentionally, purposely, they're fuzzy, right? And that's because in the lived experience, that's exactly how they are experienced. They are fuzzy, they move, they change. Some of them are meant to evolve, some of them stay the same. Some of them we wish would not change. I would love for my age to still be 21, y'all. But they move and change in very real ways. And some of our identities become more or less important to us based on context, right? So it's more important to me oftentimes that I'm a mom when I'm at one of my kids' events or at their school or participating in PTO. But on the other hand, it may be more important to me that I'm African American based on a place and space where there might be predominantly white individuals at that venue or event. Or I'm thinking about language when I am in, for example, last summer when I spent time on a study tour in Japan, and most people didn't speak English. And so given that, thinking about where I am. Now, the most unique part of this that I have never seen on any other social identity wheel is that white area on the social identity wheel. The intersectional, ascribed, and avowed identities. We'll define intersectional in a bit, so I won't do that at this time. But let's talk about the ascribed and the avowed identities. So ascribed means that it's an identity that I give to someone, and I may or may not be accurate with that, right? So let's say I'm walking down the street and afar, I see someone walking down the street and they are of the same, let's say, skin color as myself. Initially, I may assume that that person is African American, and so I may ascribe that identity onto them. But then as I get closer, maybe we share a conversation, maybe we even become friends, and I find out that that person actually is not African American, but they identify as, let's say, Indian, for example. Well, I ascribed, going back to the Latin base word scribe, I wrote the identity of African American on that individual mistakenly, but their avowed identity is Indian. They are connected to an identity that may or may not jive with what I perceive their identity to be. And so we have to be open to this. And I think we run into a lot of problems with this concept, especially when we're thinking about our LGBTQ plus siblings, when we want to write or ascribe an identity onto individuals based on pronoun, for example, when that may not be the way they identify or avow, right? So let's hold those into contention that, yes, my brain automatically wants to categorize individuals or maybe label individuals, at the same time being open to mistakenly labeling or categorizing an individual and just simply being open to new information that can correct that and also to help us to engage with others, individuals and groups. Now, STEMpunks created this really cool neurodiversity identity wheel. And I first ran across this when I was doing research because my son was diagnosed with ADHD, but recently also on the autism spectrum. And so I was reading and learning more about his experiences. And this was a really important way for me to think about all the different ways neurodiversity shows up, as well as how it can show up in the workplace. Now, what I think is super important about neurodiversity, not that we need to become experts at this time, but also as employers, what are ways that we can universally design organizations and the way in which we work that's inviting to folks that are neurodiverse and everyone else, frankly. So Stanford is doing really good work on neurodivergence, especially in the workplace, and for those that are caregivers, for those that are neurodivergent. And what I think is really important about this, let me give you a great example of how this can help an overall organization to have more inclusive excellence. So let's say you're like my son. He really does a good job with things if you give him a very detailed list, a checklist, a protocol, a procedure of things to do, right? Sound familiar in the workplace? And so I might write a list of this is exactly how to clean your room, or this is exactly how I'd like the kitchen to be cleaned, or this is exactly how we are going to go about cleaning out the car, for example, whatever it may be. Well, think about our workplaces and how that would help everyone to understand the standard of work in our workplaces. So not only would a checklist or a protocol policy procedure, would that procedure help everyone, it adds to our history. It adds to our documented understanding of standard operating procedures. So it, in fact, not only becomes inviting to someone who's neurodivergent, but it becomes more clear to everyone so they understand the standard of excellence within your organization, right? And I could go on and on with this particular area, but I thought it was something that we really want to lift up so that folks who may think, oh, this is just an extra task and I don't want to do this. I understand that neurodivergence is real, but it just feels like an extra task. It is an extra task that's not catering to one, but benefiting so many. So I want us to think about that universal design piece of our workplaces. Oh, and even more identity wheels. Let's go into a few more. As you can see, this one on the left is a little bit blurry, but that's because this is an older one. This is from 1996, where the spokes on this wheel, which would primarily apply to United States context, is that this really helps us to think about identity from the power dynamic of this work, right? So one end, for example, shows the less privileged or possibly the oppressed group, whereas the other end shows the more privileged group, right? So for example, around the world, oftentimes in many places globally, when it comes to identity group, male individuals have quite a few more privileges than female individuals, depending on the context, right? Or attractive people may have much more privileges than unattractive individuals. I always think about this when artists, especially musicians and so forth, are deemed as more quote unquote marketable or not. I always wonder what that means, but I assume oftentimes that that means appearance and physical attractiveness, for example. I may be off on that, but it's something that I think about when it comes to the privilege of identity, right? And then one more. This is one that was adapted from Sylvia Duckworth's Wheel of Power and Privilege that helps us to think once again about how power plays in identity. Power playing in identity. So this wheel is constructed in a little bit of a different way, where the more powerful are more internal to the circle and the less powerful are external to the circle, right? So for example, when it comes to race, white is seen as more powerful and more racialized externally are seen as more marginalized, right? Married, folks that are married versus those that are widowed, divorced, or single. So yet again, another way to think about multiple identities at the same time and the power dynamics between all of them, okay? All right, so I promised us that we would get into intersectionality. And so here we are, Kimberly Crenshaw, the amazing author, lawyer, professor, attorney. I got to hear her on a virtual workshop just a bit ago as we were trying to figure out how to deal with this current presidential administration. And let me just say, she is, what, 35 years later, just as powerful in her voice around these topics as she's always been. But she is the woman that coined intersectionality. And I would encourage you to look at the original case that talked about developing this word, where an African-American woman was being discriminated against in certain spaces based on gender and other spaces based on race. But then when we bring it all together, that's when things become more complex. And we hadn't really found language to grapple with more than one oppressed or marginalized identity. And so intersectionality is not just the mix of identity, but it is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression, and that we need to consider everything and anything that can marginalize people. So it compounds these issues. So what does it mean to be not just African American and not just a woman, but an African American woman in my lived experience? What does it mean to be have less access to money, resources, real estate, all the different economic endeavors, sexual orientation, physical ability, etc.? How do we really think through how there's this compound experience of oppression? I don't think we think about that very often as far as that compound issue of oppression. Now, what I think is really important is that we need to really recalibrate when we are invited into places and spaces that are talking about multiple identities versus intersectionality, right? I was invited to moderate a panel of folks that wanted to talk about intersectionality, but the majority of the folks on that panel identified as white men with one white woman on the panel. Lots of privileged identities there. Now, I did not get to know any of them personally, so there may have been other oppressed identities that were not visible identities, but judging a book by its cover, there were not a lot of oppressed identities. And so with that, I had to question the mix of the panel. I chose not to participate, but I challenged them kindly. I challenged them to think about what are the identities that are present on the panel, and do they represent multiple oppressions rather than just multiple identities? Okay. So it's the interconnected nature of social categories as they apply to an individual or group, and how they overlap, right? They overlap, and they become these interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. While I was a professorial lecturer at George Washington University in DC, I had a wonderful, beautiful student that I just connected with immediately. And let me share with you some of her intersectional identities. She's a woman, African American, from the Deep South with not a lot of money, identified as bisexual, and also was of the deaf community because she attended Gallaudet University, the first and only university that was established for the deaf community. Okay, so she would embody a number of oppressed identities, and she's my best example of intersectionality to help us think about how complex oppression can be. All right, so we've gotten through a lot of language. I would never profess to say that we've gotten through even the majority of them, but these are the fundamental ones on which a lot of others are built. So we got started, all right, we hit the ground running. Now let's get into hot topics. Like I mentioned before, these can be topics that have been interesting and important topics for decades, and there's some that are relatively new. So I mentioned hot topics. I didn't make my coffee yet, but I just wanted to share I'm a coffee lover. That's one of my personal identities there. And so it's a hot topic. Make sure that you take the time to process these particular topics. All right. So here it is, the 6 forms of power. Once again, let me harken back to Lily Zhang. And Lily Zhang, like I mentioned before, has been so powerful in this work. Their voice is really encapsulated into the book and the workbook, DEI Deconstructed. I really think you should pick up copies of those. It's a book that was published in 2023. DEI Deconstructed, your no-nonsense guide to doing the work and doing it right. It has become a reference book for me and my work and even my team. I actually bought a copy for everybody on my team at Gold Enterprises because I felt it was just that important. But Lily maps out beautifully these 6 forms of power. And I want to go through them really quickly because until I read this particular chapter in Lily's book, I knew that there obviously was more than just this binary thinking of power. It's not that you exist in an organization where you either have power or you don't, but what's the parsing out of the power, right? What's the parsing out? And the parsing out of the power, I think, at least begins with these 6. There may be others, but I think this is a great framework for you to think about as you begin to break out of the binary thought of power. So first, formal power at the top there. That's the right to request behavior from another person, whether you're a supervisor or a manager that's requesting behavior from an individual, or let's say you're a coach of a team that you're requesting certain behavior. It's that formal power that can oftentimes come from title, especially when we're in organizations that have deep org charts, right? Then we have the reward power. The reward power. That's the ability to promise compensation to influence behavior. And so with that, you can kind of what I call dangle the carrot, right? Now, I would suggest as a parent, I have this, right? Think about your power in that if you happen to be a parent or a caregiver, son, if you clean your room, we'll get ice cream, right? Or if you make honor roll this particular quarter or semester, then I will take you to this movie that's coming out, right? We have the ability to reward individuals. And so that is a form of power or influence of an individual. Now, I think of this when we think about donors, right? I will donate this if you put my name on the side of the building, right? Um, then we have coercive power, the ability to threaten punishment to influence behavior, right? So if you don't do this during this quarter, then you won't get your bonus, right? If you don't do this presentation, then you won't get that professional development budget that I promised everybody. If you don't do this, then you won't get your merit increase, right? So this is yet again another way of pulling back on things in order to coerce someone. Well, I don't want to do it, but now I have to because I really need that bonus because that pays for Christmas for my family, or that pays for the summer holiday vacation, right? So that's coercive power. Expert power, the ability to influence behavior by possessing greater expertise or ability. So think about our scientific experts, scholars, researchers. I really felt bad, to be honest with you all, for Dr. Anthony Fauci when the pandemic was going on. Imagine having 38 years of experience studying infectious diseases, working with the CDC and others, spending your entire life studying the scientific method of this work, being a prolific scholar, author, writer, influencer, I would say, and then kind of being undermined by us as general population saying, well, I can just Google it and whatever I find, that's what I'll do. Oh, I don't need to mask. I don't need to social distance. I don't mean to get on a soapbox here, but it is a great example, whether you agree or disagree with masking or any of those other influences that we were discussing back then in 2020. But the reality was we had a supremely well-versed, well-researched, well-studied individual that probably has more knowledge on one topic than anyone in our entire country. And they could influence what people do, right? I took my cues from Dr. Fauci. I remember we had come somewhat out of the pandemic. We were in early 2022, and I believe that was one of my first flights after the pandemic. And I remember seeing a clip of Dr. Fauci saying, hey, I realize folks aren't masking anymore in public, but I still will mask on airplanes. And so guess what? He deeply influenced me. I still mask on airplanes. My children mask on airplanes, et cetera. So that expert power certainly can influence us. And then the informational power, the ability to influence behavior by possessing greater information, right? So think about that person, two people I'm thinking about in particular, that long-term employee that has decades of information. And that's where we historically have heard of this as information hoarding, right? That individual influences what happens and what doesn't happen based on what they know and keep to themselves, right? And in past, we've thought, well, if I'm an information hoarder, then that secures my job. And when we found as technology improved and got sharper, and now we have AI, really that doesn't protect you anymore anyway. So why not collaborate, right? So that long-term employee, and the second person that I would consider, given that I've been one in the past in a former life here, executive assistants, people that are gatekeepers. And remember that gate swings to and fro, right? You can let people in and you can leave people out. They have the informational power to give folks access. So if I'm the executive executive assistant, then I can make decisions on who has access to that senior vice president or CEO. I can make decisions on what's on that agenda that I'm drafting up for the next meeting or what gets left off of the agenda, right? So I have that informational power to influence. And then referent power. So that means I have the ability to build rapport and influence certain behaviors through my charisma or through my own character, right? So think about that client dinner, for example, where you're trying to woo someone into the work, right? I think of this in particular with referent power, building rapport and influence. I had a position, and this is often the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. I had a position where I was the highest ranking individual that had diversity, equity, and inclusion in my role at a particular organization, yet I had absolutely zero direct reports, not one. I didn't even have an executive assistant. So now I did have an executive assistant that was willing to do things on my behalf. But at the same time, I had no one on the org chart that directly reported to me, but I had 6 colleges, 66 departments, and over 1,300 faculty members that took cues from my influence based on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? So I have the referent power to build rapport with those individuals, get to know them well, and then influence them in particular directions, okay? All right, so let's get into privilege, which usually gets me into trouble when I'm doing trainings with various organizations that may not be used to talking about this topic in particular. But let's talk about it. I love this particular protest poster. It says, privilege is when you think something is not a problem because you aren't affected personally. That's why when I was mentioning on the social identity wheel that those areas that you don't have to think about often are probably areas of privilege because you don't have to think about when the elevator goes out, can I actually climb 3 sets of stairs to get to whom I need to get to, right? Or, like my grandmother, for example, if the font is not big enough in a book or on a sheet of paper, is she going to be able to see it or not? She doesn't have to think about that. She does have to think about that. I don't have to think about that. So she doesn't carry that privilege while I do, the able-bodiedness piece of the identity wheel, okay? So I think the problem oftentimes is that we don't describe in detail the various levels of privilege. Usually it's kind of that binary thought of all or nothing. Either you have privilege or you don't, right? That's not exactly how it works in real life, okay? With this, we have a number of levels of privilege. So earned privilege, for example, is the result of hard work and persistence, something that we've earned. I often think about earned privilege when I listen to commencements, graduations, any celebratory events where someone has earned and checked all the requirements off that they've completed in order to earn something where others who have not checked that list have not earned that privilege, okay? So, getting that certificate, getting the diploma, the degree, the credentialing, for example, that is an earned privilege. Someone exchanged their time, energy, effort to complete the requirements, right? But then we have unearned privilege. Unearned privilege. So this is the enjoyment of certain advantages simply because we are a member of a particular group, right? So, for example, I may not have earned the ability to, let's say, go to the community pool just because, let's say I didn't pay for it or what have you. Maybe I was born in the right community where it's free anyway, right? So I didn't do anything special to earn access to the pool in the summer, but it's an unearned privilege, right? And I can think of many more, but remember that this unearned privilege and the lack of spreading access equitably, it maintains power of some, and then it maintains the oppression of other individuals. And so that's how systems are created. Those unearned privileges that we hold in real time and we even bolster in certain ways, right? So I remember, for example, when I learned about this concept, as you can see on the right, there's this map. And back in the 50s and 60s, this was called a safety map. Now, let's give the side eye to that labeling of safety map. But for those of us that have not heard of the language and the concept of redlining, redlining was actually these types of maps that were used to draw red lines and other color lines, but red lines around particular communities, delineating particular communities by race and particularly by African American race. This is one example of many. And so redlining meant oftentimes that there were communities that were deemed more safe or less safe, communities that were deemed to receive more resources or less resources, communities that were attended to first in the case of emergency or last in the case of emergency. I've even worked with utility companies, for example, that still to this day, after what, now 60 years or more, all these years of redlining, now it's trickled down into understanding, yes, we have more diversity in neighborhoods, but there are still very redlined community remnants of redlining where those utility companies still historically don't tend to the needs of those communities first or in order of receipt, for example. Or let's say there's been a huge electrical storm and that electrical storm wiped out one neighborhood that happened to be people of color, for example, and so they go to that neighborhood last rather than first, right? And so given that, thinking about how this trickles down, now redlining is one example of unearned privilege, but there are many others. For example, I have a wonderful friend, Tara. I'm going to pick on her in this example here. But Tara and I, we have very similar backgrounds. We both are raising two kids, and we just really adore one another as we partner to do this type of work often. But imagine she and I live across the street from one another. We have the same size house, same size yard, in the same neighborhood, but it happens to be that that proverbial red line runs through the middle of our street. So that means even though we have the same home, same square footage, same access, house built at the same time, same year, her home will be more valuable and my home will be less valuable. Well, what does that mean in real time? That means that, unfortunately, I won't be able to pass down as much generational wealth to my kids as she will because my house won't sell at the same price point as hers. All these things that she didn't earn, but also I didn't lose necessarily. These are privileges that show up that unfortunately, based on historical ramifications, have to be interrupted, right? Redlining and my friend Tara and I proverbially living across the street. This is what happens in real time historically, day to day, that we currently did not create, but we all are feeling the same ramifications of, even decades later. All right, let's talk about bias, another hot topic that I still, for years, continue to get requests to do trainings and engagements on. So let's talk about bias, and also let's break this down too, just like we broke down privilege. So bias is that predisposition for or against a person, place, thing, or situation. I oftentimes use the example of during the holidays, y'all, there may be some of y'all that want a pumpkin pie over a sweet potato pie, right? You have a bias towards one or the other. I was raised on the sweet potato pies, y'all. But then we have other folks that may want other desserts entirely. They want an apple pie, they want chocolate pie, they want some other fruit pie, whatever it is. Now, as I shared with you, I was raised on sweet potato pie, but guess what? Just because I have a bias towards that sweet potato pie, if I have a choice, I'm going to choose sweet potato pie. I did not say that I didn't like those other pies. Yeah, I'm a foodie, y'all. But the reality is I lean towards one, which means that I may lean away from others, right? And that's exactly what happens in our organizations. We may lean towards one identity, one thought pattern, even one framework, and lean towards one and lean away from others, right? And this is part of our lived experiences, right? It's part of our lived experiences. But let's talk about implicit bias, where it's this predisposition that you're not even aware is happening. You're unaware of it. It runs almost like a software system in the back of your brain. And as a result, it becomes an unexamined basis of your actions, right? So I remember, let me give you this implicit bias. I now remember, now that I've reflected on it, I have a bias towards Krispy Kreme donuts. But I have a bias against Dunkin' Donuts, right? So my implicit bias, until I really thought about it, my implicit bias against Dunkin' Donuts was many, many moons ago. I heard about a sanitary issue with Dunkin' Donuts, and it made the headlines, and they lost lots of money because people stopped stopping in for their breakfast there. They stopped going there. And I didn't realize until more recently, I saw that news story again, and I'm like, wow, I saw that news story, gosh, decades ago. And I didn't realize that it had been influencing my decision making. So it's not to say that I couldn't like both. I could prefer Krispy Kreme and still go to Dunkin' Donuts, right? But I realized I had this unexamined bias based on being exposed to that news story long ago, right? So that was an implicit bias. I wasn't aware of it. But there are some of us that do have explicit bias, meaning that we have predispositions that we are aware of, and it's the basis of our actions, right? So, for example, in organizations, think about being a veteran as a CEO or owner of a company and always leaning towards hiring veterans, regardless of qualifications and skills. Now, we know there's lots of high qualified veterans and former military, but let's just say, not looking at qualifications, you always lean towards hiring that vet, right? Or the converse, you're a civilian, and when a veteran that's highly qualified applies, you lean towards not hiring for them because there may be some stereotypes around those veterans. So some, as we can tell, we are unaware of the bias, and some we are aware, and we make decisions accordingly off of both. My goal is not to completely debias you, because that's almost impossible. But my goal is to help us to unearth those implicit biases so that they become explicit, and then we can examine them and then start to turn towards anti-bias. And anti-bias is when we're actively and intentionally working through those biases and interrupting them, and even asking for accountability amongst our colleagues as we all work towards debiasing our work. Now, bias work quickly. It works very quickly. If you snap your fingers right now, usually even for a quick person, one snap takes 1 second, right? But as Deadpool says, you have failed me, brain. And that happens every single day where our brain fails us, meaning it only takes 50 milliseconds, much shorter than this snap. It only takes 50 milliseconds to register someone's gender, or what we think is someone's gender, right? It only takes twice that long to note their racial background based off of Harvard's implicit association test findings. Only takes us twice as long to register what we think is race. And again, remember what I mentioned before about that previous social identity wheel that myself and Dr. Ingerfield created. What we think is gender or racial background goes to that avowed and ascribed identity groups, right? We may be inaccurate on what we ascribe. Sociologists have identified about 50 different biases, and they include everything from social class to religion, wealth, education, national and regional roots. Political affiliation is quite prominent right now, physical attractiveness, and other forms of biases. All right, we assume certain things that may or may not be true, and so we always have to interrupt our bias by asking, do I have data and information to support my leaning? All right. All right, an elder from the First Nations, the Aboriginal Canadian, Dr. Duke Redbird, used this wonderful framework to think about microaggressions, another hot topic. Microaggressions are when bias actually influence action, right? So it's one thing to think all these things in our mind, but it's another thing to take action on those biases, right? And so given that, microaggressions are those verbal or nonverbal slights and insults, they chip away at an individual, right? And usually it's a reminder to marginalized people that they are outsiders, not insiders. They are not part of the dominant culture. They're on the fringes, and that's why it's called margin. They are marginalized. They're on the margins of a dominant culture. Whether it's intentional or not, microaggressions have a lasting impact. I have a good friend of mine who is a African American history professor at Indiana University, and she always tells me, hey, I don't use micro anymore. I just say aggression, right? Because who are we to determine the large or the size of the impact on that individual? A slight is still harmful. I don't know about you all, but I've had a paper cut before. And so Dr. Redbird talks about death by 1,000 cuts. A microaggression is a death by 1,000 cuts. It seems very small, but it has a large impact, and it's cumulative over time. Cumulative over time. All right, so LGBTQ plus identities are crucial to our work and will continue to be a hot topic as we continue to stay on the front lines of support and allyship and being accomplices to this work. Sam Killerman back in 2018 gave us version 4 of what is called the gingerbread person. And the gingerbread person is a great way for even a kid to understand LGBTQ plus identities. And so I'm going to go through these really quickly here, but just know that there's an entire glossary and experience around these words. And so I'm just going to give you the baseline pillars of LGBTQ plus language and identity. And then I hope that you'll continue to do the work of learning more. But first, let's think about that bottom right arrow. So that is sex. So sex is body parts and chromosomes. And we're talking about biology here. What body parts does one have, right? So this could be one sex or another sex or more than one, right? There are individuals, for example, that may be born with no ovaries, for example, but have a vagina, for example, or have a penis and have ovaries. So there's lots of different mixes just depending on one's birth that they individually cannot control, okay? Then we have sexual orientation. So that is the heart. So emotion, sexual and or romantic attraction to other individuals, right? So who one is attracted to, I almost think about a magnet. Who are we magnetized to or not based on our sexual orientation? And there's lots of language to describe the various sexual orientations, okay? Identity, head and brain. So one's own internal sense of personal experience of gender. And I will say this is one of my biggest soapboxes as one who wrote my dissertation on LGBT college students. I see people stepping over the lines of identity, meaning that they want to go back to that, what we called ascribed identity, with complete disrespect and disregard for someone's avowed identity. I may not call someone one pronoun that they do not ascribe to. I may not call them a first name that they are not ascribed to. And so with that, that is a hard line of respect for me, a real line in the sand that I see being violated quite a bit. Now, I'm not talking about the people that are learning like I am, learning and sometimes fumbling over pronouns or language as we continue to learn, because that is part of this process. I'm not talking about those that are giving a sincere effort. And of course, we're human, so we make mistakes. But folks that intentionally disregard, misname, dead name individuals because they want to disregard identity. So that's a soapbox for Shauna. And then expression and appearance. So external representation, usually expressed through behavior, clothing, appearance, demeanor, or actions. So how does one express themselves? Through their hair, through their jewelry, makeup, clothing. How do they express themselves, and what are the options for doing so, right? What are the options for doing so? All right, so allyship was the word of the year one year from Merriam-Webster, and I think it's important for us to think about. I would imagine that you aspire to be an ally if you are in this particular training, but allyship is someone who makes the commitment and the effort to recognize their privilege based on gender, class, sexual identity, all of that social identity wheel. They recognize their privilege and they continue to work Note that that's active, not passive. They work in solidarity with oppressed groups in the struggle for justice. So you don't have to be a part of a particular group in order to be supportive. In fact, as one that straddles that fence, where depending on the setting, I am privileged in one identity, in several identities, but I am marginalized in other identities, I make sure that I do speak up when the time comes for those that I'm not in their identity group, but I want to support because I realize how exhausting it is to always have to be the voice that speaks up for one's own identity. It becomes exhausting. It is fatigue on top of the work you're already doing. And so with this, I love this particular visual because it shows all the different ways that one can be an internal ally within an organization and also externally an ally. So for example, if you're inside an organization, pay equity might be one way to demonstrate allyship and right some historical wrongs. Whereas external allyship may be something like mission and purpose statements that communicate what's going on internally to external collaborators or stakeholders, right? So there's lots of examples of that inward and outward facing work. And in fact, as Gold Enterprises, as consultants coming in to help people create the best places for people to work, learn, and grow, what I think is really important to this work is that unfortunately we have what's the superhero or the villain, I should say. Batman's villain was Two-Face. That's it. Where you have two different faces in your organization. So, for example, externally, you may be this mission-driven organization that has this great reputation for doing phenomenal work. But if you turn internally, folks internally feel disrespected. They don't feel like a sense of belonging is high. In fact, they may wonder and in fact have this greater conundrum to think, how is it that I represent some of the populations that we serve and you are so gracious and kind and inclusive to those individuals internally, externally, but when you come to internal work with me, you're like a different person. You're a different organization. So we don't want those two-face allyship organizations where allyship is externally demonstrated, but internally lacking. All right, then we get into dialogue. Dialogue, I love this piece. I wish I could do this all the time. But dialogue is when we create sustained face-to-face communication, and they can be virtual face-to-face now. But we're raising the social consciousness of a particular topic. We build bridges across group differences intentionally in such a way that we learn how to work together through our commonalities. And let's be clear, the goal of dialogue is not agreement, it is understanding. So let's say we bring together some of the most diametrically opposed factions in an organization or across organizations. If we set this up where we just throw people in a conversation and let them rip, then most likely that is going to be a debate and it is not going to be pretty. And unfortunately, that's what we often do. We think, oh, well, if we can just get people together, we'll work it out. Not with a deft hand, not without a deft hand in this work. You need a deft hand that knows how to moderate dialogue in particular. And so let me share with you how important that is. Dialogue is part of staying with it, keeping track of people in regards to how we engage on our common points, knowing that there will be differences, right? It becomes another language, if you will. We are launching a wonderful dialogue institute to help people that want to learn how to facilitate dialogues. It's a train the trainer, but it's an essential skill that I want you to really learn and grapple with if you want to become more of a leader or strategist in this area. Okay. All right. So this was a lot. And let me be clear, this was scratching the surface. Like I mentioned previously, this is a gateway into this work. This is where I start with people who say they want to be in this work more heavily, more deeply, folks that even want to become more strategists than just programming or coordinators, which we need all of us to do this work. And so how do we stay up to speed on these evolving topics? Staying with it is really important. How do we keep up with it? Here's how we do it. I remember one of my good friends said that she would always have what's called a meeting with Myrtle, which I thought was so funny. But a meeting with Myrtle is that scheduled self-study time where you bring it upon yourself to set aside a time where you are focused on this work. Meaning that, let's say, for example, throughout your week, you find articles or you discover online courses like this or some of the other courses we have in our catalog, whatever. You can use a podcast maybe that you want to listen to. Continue to stockpile those, right? I used to keep an email folder with all of those articles that I wanted to read, or I would bookmark all of the podcasts that I want to listen to. However you choose to pull together your information. Don't read it yet. Just pull it together when you see it, right? Then you have a designated day or time during your week where you set aside your meeting with Myrtle, which is your meeting with yourself, right? And that's when you have that scheduled self-study. So you can go back and read those articles. You can go back and listen to that podcast. You can go back and watch that particular virtual training that you wanted to get into. You can go back and read those supplemental resources and articles that came along with that conference you went to a month ago. But it's a set aside time that stays in your calendar weekly with this work. For me, my meeting with Myrtle used to be, so my youngest son would always have a practice. He would have a practice 3-4 days a week, and each practice was probably 2 or more hours each. My meetings with Myrtle ended up being those saved podcasts that I would listen to while I walked around the track during his football or lacrosse practice, right? Or my oldest son would have a play rehearsal, and it would be at least a 2 or 3 hour rehearsal. I would go down to the corner at the local library, and I would put my headphones in and listen to my podcast or read those articles while I'm multitasking, hanging out for him. So designate your meeting with Myrtle on a weekly basis so you can stay up to speed on interesting topics, right? And also get the information to roll downstream to you too. So set up filters with some of your favorite outlets, like maybe Medium, The Atlantic, New York Times, whatever your medium are. And let that information roll downstream for your meeting with Myrtle, okay? Study the language. There are countless glossaries out there. Compare and contrast the information within those glossaries, right? So that you can stay up to speed with language that is being used, okay? Working with groups and structured conversations, right? You may be part of a employee resource group within your organization, or maybe a committee within your organization. Set aside time for more information like this, and make time to process it. So don't just take part or listen to an expert or someone like me coming in to talk about a topic, but then set aside that discussion time to grapple with things that maybe you hadn't processed before. Engaging with other DEI strategists in the field. Now, I will say that there are different levels to this, and there's also different expertise. You might have someone like Kimberly Crenshaw that I mentioned before that has 35 plus years of experience, myself, 25, 28 years of experience, and then someone that might be newer, maybe 5 to 10 years in this work. But I think we have valuable intergenerational information to share with one another. So come together and have these conversations, and then purposefully get uncomfortable. Read about a topic that you've never read about before. I most recently have been reading a lot about African-American slaveholders. And for example, white women slaveholders in the South. I read a lot on Japanese culture before we went to Japan last summer. So a lot of these identities that we saw on the identity wheel, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, I read that. These are areas that I did not have a lot of experience in, but that's the whole point of education. We don't read about things to confirm what we know. We read also to expand what we know. So purposefully get uncomfortable, okay? And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't share with you what we do as Gold Enterprises. I have a wonderful team. There are 3 of us that are our main core consultancy, but we also have a deep roster of 12 different consultants and experts in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion that have their own identity areas of deep expertise. And so with that, we have a lot to share with you, and would love to do that moving forward. And so one way, of course, is to check out learning opportunities with us, go onto our website and check out all of the services that we provide, including the list, the catalog of set courses that we provide for folks, both live, asynchronous, synchronous, virtually, in person. So certainly check those learning opportunities out with us. We are building our own community over at Substack. We know that social media has become very questionable in its values and policies. And so we find that although we don't want to remove what now 16, 17 years of social media presence in other places, we also realize that we need to invest in places like Substack and other platforms that have our shared values. So we are building a community over at Substack, and we invite you to join us there to read, to listen, to learn. I have been dropping information through my very quick micro community called House Business, where we talk about very difficult topics in a little bit of a long form, but not as long as a course. So I invite you to join me there. We have over 200 episodes of the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion topics that affect every industry, who's in and out, in an industry agnostic way. So I would encourage you to check out all 3 of these links and make sure that you join us at any and all of those places. I have a newsletter as well that you can certainly subscribe to so that you can get my thoughts and offerings each week from Gold Enterprises. But again, we'd love to continue to engage with you, but this is the gateway into the work. I encourage you to contact us because our mission, like I mentioned before, is to guide organizations to become the best places for everyone to work, learn, play, and grow. So here's how to reach us. Take a screenshot of this if you like, or just go to our website, goldenterprisesllc.com, to find everything you need there. But with that, I will stop share and thank you so much for joining me with this gateway course. I think At a Loss for Words has been in my back pocket for years, and I've been kind of hoarding that information. I'm guilty of hoarding that information and only sharing it in live or in virtual spaces where it is synchronous. But I decided, hey, let's make sure everybody has access to this so that they can even get started without embarrassment, without any shame, without walking in thinking like, who's going to judge me because I didn't know this information that maybe I should have known. No worries. We're here for you. And so we hope you enjoy this particular gateway course, At a Loss for Words. And we'll see you next time as we continue to build out the Gold Course Catalog on all of our various platforms. But thank you for being with me and my group, Gold Enterprises LLC. We'll see you soon. Reach out to us if you need us.